There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone, and everything to do with being unable to say the thing you actually mean. Picture it, a voice that can no longer form its own first word, forever condemned to speak only the last words that someone else has already spoken, borrowing every sentence it will ever say for the rest of its existence. And picture, in the very same story, its perfect and terrible opposite. A beautiful young man, so completely unable to look outward, so entirely closed in upon himself, that he falls in love, in the end, with nothing at all except his own reflected face, and wastes away beside a quiet pool because he cannot bear to look anywhere else. Tonight we are going to follow both of them together, the woman who could only echo, and the man who could only mirror, and ask what it was, in each of them, that made real love, the kind that reaches outward, toward another person, and risks something in the reaching, entirely impossible. To understand how a nymph came to lose her own voice, and how a beautiful young man came to fall in love with water, we must begin, as this particular tale insists on beginning with a jealous queen and a very clever trick that finally stopped working. Her name was Echo, and before her curse, before the pool, before any of the sorrow this story is remembered for, she was one of the most delightful and talkative of all the wood nymphs who filled the forests and mountainsides of ancient Greece. A companion of Artemis by some tellings, endlessly chattering, endlessly charming, the sort of nymph whose voice you could hear laughing and singing through the trees long before you ever caught sight of her. And it was precisely this gift, this endless and irrepressible fondness for conversation, that drew her into a dangerous position at the edge of the affairs of the gods. For Zeus, as we have had occasion to notice more than once on this channel, had a long-standing habit of pursuing beautiful and mortal women alike, across the mountains and valleys of Greece, and his wife Hera, no less consistently, had a long-standing habit of hunting down those same nymphs to punish them for a straying husband's wandering eye. And Echo, clever and quick and endlessly willing to talk, it made herself useful to Zeus in exactly the way that talkative company so often becomes useful to someone hiding something. Whenever Hera came searching through the mountains, suspicious of where her husband had gone, and which nymph he might be keeping company with that particular afternoon, Echo would place herself directly in the queen's path and engage her in long, winding, endlessly entertaining conversation, spinning out story after story and question after question, holding the goddess's attention just long enough every single time for Zeus and whichever nymph he happened to be visiting that day to slip quietly away unnoticed. It worked, as these tricks always seemed to work in the old stories, for exactly as long as it took the trickster to eventually be found out. Hera, growing steadily more suspicious of just how often her husband managed to vanish, whenever this particular chattering nymph happened to intercept her, finally understood the pattern for what it was, and her fury, when it landed, was aimed with the precision Hera always brought to punishing those who had helped her husband deceive her. She did not simply banish Echo or curse her with some ordinary misfortune. She reached for the one gift that had made the whole deception possible in the first place: Echo's endless, effortless fluency, her gift for holding a listener's attention with her own original words. And she took it away entirely, and in its place she left something crueler and stranger than simple silence. From that day forward, Hera decreed Echo would never again be able to speak first. She could no longer begin a sentence of her own, could no longer offer an opinion, could no longer ask a question or share a single original thought unprompted. She could only repeat, helplessly, automatically, the very last words that someone else had already spoken to her, echoing them back exactly as she had heard them, and nothing more. The gift of endless conversation that had once made her so charming and so useful had been turned, in a single stroke, into its own precise and mocking opposite. A voice that could only ever follow, and could never again lead. Consider, for a moment, the particular cruelty built into that punishment, because it is worth understanding fully before the second half of this story begins. When Echo's curse collides with someone who could not possibly have been a worse match for it. To take away a nymph's voice entirely would have been one kind of punishment, simple and total. But Hera did something crueler and more precisely aimed than that. She left Echo just enough voice to make the loss unbearable rather than merely absent, enough to let her hear every single day for the rest of her long, immortal life exactly how far her own words had once carried, and exactly how completely that gift was gone now, replaced by a kind of speech that could never truly belong to her again. Every word Echo would ever say again, for the whole rest of her existence, would be borrowed. She could comfort no one in her own language. She could confess nothing in her own words. She could only wait and listen and give back exactly what she was given, a mirror made of sound instead of glass. And it is this: a nymph reduced entirely to repetition, unable ever again to say the first true thing she actually meant, who wandered, not long after her curse fell upon her, into a forest clearing, and saw, for the first time, a beautiful young hunter named Narcissus. To understand Narcissus, and the particular flaw that would eventually mirror Echo's curse so precisely that the two of them seem, across the whole span of this story, almost designed to have been made for one another, and for no one else, we must go back a little further to the moment of his birth, to a strange and unsettling prophecy that hung over him from his very first breath. His mother was a river nymph named Liriope, his father the river god Cephisus. And when the boy was born, so beautiful even as an infant that his mother could scarcely believe her own eyes, she went to the great, blind prophet Tiresias, the same Tiresias whose visions never once failed to come true across the whole of Greek myth, and asked him whether her extraordinary son would live to see old age. And Tiresias gave her an answer stranger than any prophecy in these old tales usually offers. An answer with no clear condition attached to it, no obvious danger to avoid, no monster to fear or oracle to obey. He will live to a ripe old age, Tiresias told her, if he never comes to know himself. It is a prophecy that sounds, on its surface, almost like a riddle with no practical use at all. What could it possibly mean? To warn a mother that her son's survival depends on him never knowing himself. And Liriope, understandably, had no clear way to act on so strange a warning, and could only wait and watch her son grow and wonder, across the years that followed, exactly what shape that prophecy might eventually take. And Narcissus grew, as the years passed, into precisely the kind of beauty that a strange prophecy like that one seems almost designed to punish. He was, by every account the old poets left us, extraordinarily, almost impossibly handsome, the kind of beauty that stopped strangers in their tracks, that drew the eye of nymph and mortal alike wherever he walked through the forests and hills of his homeland. A young man whose face alone seemed capable of commanding a devotion that most people spend a lifetime trying to earn through kindness or courage or wit. And this extraordinary gift, given to him so completely and so early, did precisely what such gifts so often do to those who receive them, without ever having to work for them. It made him proud, and it made him cold, and it made him, above nearly everyone he ever encountered, entirely unmoved by the devotion he inspired so effortlessly in others. Suitor after suitor, nymph after nymph, young man after young man, came to him with genuine and aching love, and Narcissus, again and again, turned each one away, with the same careless cruelty, seemingly untouched by the wreckage of hearts he left scattered behind him, wherever his hunting brought him. It is worth pausing on this pattern before Echo ever enters the story properly, because it tells us something important about the young man she was about to fall in love with. Narcissus had already, long before he ever met her, perfected the particular cruelty of being loved and simply not caring, of accepting devotion as though it were owed to him rather than freely given, and discarding it again and again without a flicker of guilt or gratitude. It was in the middle of one of his solitary hunts, wandering deep into the forest, chasing deer with a small company of companions, that Narcissus became separated from the others, and it was in that moment of solitude that Echo, who had been watching him from among the trees for some time already, her borrowed voice, unable to call out to him in any way of her own choosing, finally had her chance. She could not remember, speak first. She could not call out his name, or offer a greeting, or say a single word to draw his attention that had not already been spoken by someone else first. And so, when Narcissus, lost and separated from his hunting party, called out into the trees, asking if anyone was there, Echo could do the one thing her curse still allowed her. She could answer him. In his own words, echoed back exactly as he had spoken them. "Is anyone here?" he called, and here came her voice back to him from somewhere in the trees, and he called again. "Come to me," and "Come to me," she answered, delighted at last perhaps to have found any way at all, however borrowed, to speak to someone she had already fallen hopelessly in love with at first sight. And she stepped out from among the trees, finally, and ran toward him with her arms open, hoping, against everything her curse had already told her about the limits of what she could ever say to him, that he would understand. From her presence alone, her voice could no longer tell him on its own. And here the story delivers its particular and quiet cruelty, one that has nothing to do with monsters or gods, and everything to do with the plain, ordinary heartbreak of loving someone who was never going to love you back. Narcissus looked at the beautiful nymph running toward him with her arms open, offering everything she had left to offer, after Hera's curse had already taken away her own words, and he recoiled from her, coldly, exactly as he had recoiled from every other admirer who had ever come to him with genuine devotion. Some tellings say he told her plainly that he would rather die than let her touch him, and Echo, unable to speak a single word of her own reply, could only echo his own cruel rejection back to him in his own voice, forced by the curse that governed her to repeat the very words that were breaking her heart, unable even to protest the unfairness of it, unable to explain that she meant something entirely different by the same borrowed syllables. He walked away and left her there, humiliated and devastated in the middle of the forest, having offered the one thing her curse still allowed her to offer, and having been refused, in the cruelest possible way, by the one person she could not stop herself from loving. What followed for Echo was a slow and terrible unraveling, and the old poets describe it with a particular tenderness, as though even they could not quite bear to rush past her grief without pausing over it properly. She fled from him into the deepest and most hidden parts of the forest, ashamed of her own rejection, and there she lived out the rest of her long and sorrowful existence in solitude, wasting away with grief and longing for a love that would never be returned, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing every comfort that might have eased her suffering, until her body itself, over the slow and patient passage of time, simply faded away entirely, bone turning to stone, the last physical trace of her wasting into the rock of the hillsides she had once run through so freely and so happily before Hera's curse had ever touched her. And when even her body was finally gone, one single thing remained of everything. Echo had once been, her voice borrowed and repeating. The one part of her the curse had shaped into something that could outlast flesh and bone entirely. To this day, the old story tells us, if you call out among certain hills and lonely places, a voice will call back to you, repeating your own final words exactly as you spoke them. And that voice, and nothing else, is all that is left of a nymph who once talked so easily and so freely that a jealous queen felt the need to silence her forever. It would be easy, hearing the story only this far, to imagine that Narcissus's cruelty toward Echo went entirely unanswered, that a young man so thoroughly protected by his own beauty could simply walk away from wreckage like this forever, without ever once having to reckon with what he had done. But Echo was not the only heart Narcissus had broken carelessly on his way through the world, and among the many rejected suitors he had left scattered behind him was a young man named Amanius, who had loved Narcissus with a devotion every bit as genuine and every bit as thoroughly refused as Echo's own, and who, unable to bear the weight of that rejection any longer, had taken his own life on Narcissus's own doorstep, leaving behind, in his final breath, a bitter and heartfelt prayer to the gods, that Narcissus himself might one day fall in love with something he could never, ever have, so that he might finally understand, from the inside, exactly the kind of suffering he had so casually inflicted on everyone who had ever loved him. It is the goddess Nemesis, keeper of divine retribution, the old poets tell us, who heard that dying prayer and judged it worth answering, for she, more than almost any other power in the Greek pantheon, existed specifically to notice exactly this kind of imbalance. A beautiful young man who took love freely and gave nothing back in return, growing more careless with every heart he broke, and never once paying any price for it. Nemesis decided, quietly and patiently, that this particular debt had gone unpaid for long enough. And so, some time after Echo had already faded into stone and memory, Narcissus, tired and thirsty after another long hunt through the forest, came upon a clear and untroubled pool of water, hidden away in a quiet clearing, its surface so still and so perfectly undisturbed that it had never once, the old tellings say, been muddied by grazing cattle or fallen leaves or the passing feet of any bird or beast. He knelt at its edge to drink, and as he leaned forward, over that perfectly still surface he saw, for the first time in his whole life, something that stopped him entirely. He saw his own reflection, gazing back up at him from the water, and Narcissus, who had spent his entire life being adored by others without ever once understanding what all that devotion had actually been responding to, fell instantly and completely in love with the beautiful face staring back up at him from the pool, not recognizing it, at first, as his own reflection at all, but believing it to be some beautiful water spirit, living just beneath the surface, gazing up at him, with the same longing he suddenly, overwhelmingly, felt himself. And here at last, the old prophecy that had hung unexplained over his entire life finally revealed exactly what it had meant all along. he will live long. Tiresias had told his mother, if he never comes to know himself. And here, kneeling at the edge of a still and perfect pool, Narcissus was about to do precisely the thing the prophecy had warned him never to do. He reached down toward the beautiful face in the water, and the moment his hand broke the surface, the reflection scattered into ripples and vanished, and when the water finally stilled again, the face returned exactly as beautiful and exactly as unreachable as before. He tried again, and again the same thing happened, and slowly, across what must have been an agonizing stretch of hours, some dim understanding began to dawn on him, that the face he had fallen so completely in love with was never going to step out of the water and love him back, that every time he reached for it, he only destroyed the very thing he was reaching for, and that no matter how he pleaded, or wept, or begged the beautiful stranger in the pool to simply come to him, the reflection could only ever do exactly what he himself did, at exactly the same moment he did it, which meant, though it took him a long and painful while to fully accept it, that he had fallen in love at last with nothing, and no one but his own reflected face. It is worth pausing. Here, on the strange and precise symmetry the story has been quietly building all along, because it is easy to miss on a single hearing, and it is, I think, the whole reason these two particular stories were woven together into a single myth in the first place. Echo could only ever repeat what someone else had already said, condemned to a life in which she could never once speak a single original word of her own. Narcissus could only ever love a reflection that repeated exactly what he himself did, condemned to a devotion that could never once receive a single original response of its own. Both of them, in the end, were trapped in a kind of conversation that was really no conversation at all, an endless exchange with something that could only ever mirror back exactly what was already given to it, and never, not once, offer anything genuinely new in return. Echo's curse made her incapable of real connection with anyone else. Narcissus's own nature, long before any curse ever touched him, had already made him incapable of wanting real connection with anyone else in the first place. And so the story places them side by side, quite deliberately, as two matched and opposite tragedies, one who could not speak for herself, and one who could not love anyone but himself, and lets us watch how completely alike their two different kinds of loneliness actually turn out to be. Narcissus could not tear himself away from the pool, understanding finally that the beautiful face he loved was his own, and that no love he felt for it could ever be returned in any way that satisfied him, did not free him from the longing at all. If anything, the old poets tell us it deepened it, for now he understood with perfect and devastating clarity exactly what he wanted, and exactly why he could never, ever have it, which is a far crueler kind of suffering than simple ignorance would have been. He stayed at the water's edge, refusing to leave, refusing food, refusing rest, wasting away exactly as Echo herself had wasted away in her own hidden corner of the forest, consumed entirely by a longing that could never once be satisfied, until at last, weakened past any further endurance, he died there beside the still water, still gazing down at the face he could never touch and never keep. And in the moment of his death, the old story tells us, when the nymphs and companions who loved him came at last to gather his body for a proper burial, they found, in the place where he had died, no body at all to bury, only a new and delicate flower growing at the water's edge, white petals folded around a golden center, forever bowed down toward its own reflection in the still pool beside it. A flower that has carried his name, and something of his particular tragedy, in every language that has named it since. There is one detail worth adding here, quietly, before we close this long and sorrowful story, because it completes the symmetry the myth has been building all along, in a way that is easy to miss if the tale is told too quickly. Even in death, even reduced to nothing but the last echoes of grief, passing through the forest, where he had once wasted away entirely alone, Echo, who, by this point in the story, existed only as a disembodied and repeating voice among the hills, is said to have been there at the very end, unseen but present, and when the mourning nymphs who found Narcissus's body gone cried out in grief, and asked aloud into the empty clearing, "Alas, alas!" It was her borrowed voice, and no one else's, that answered them back, "Alas, alas!" One final echo of a grief that was, in the end, as much her own as it was theirs. The woman he had refused, all those long seasons before, was the very last voice to mourn him. Forced even now, even after everything, to say only the words that grief had already put into someone else's mouth first. And so we return, at the end, to the question this whole quiet and sorrowful story was built to ask. What is it exactly that makes real love possible between two people? And what happens when that possibility is closed off entirely, from one direction or from both? Echo's tragedy was that she had everything to give, and no way left to give it in her own voice, a devotion entirely real, entirely hers, trapped behind a curse that reduced every word of it to mere repetition, unable ever to reach the person she loved in any language he could recognize as genuinely her own. Narcissus's tragedy was the precise mirror of hers, and in some ways the harder one to feel sympathy for, and yet the story asks us to feel it anyway. A heart so thoroughly closed in upon itself, so entirely unpracticed in looking outward toward anyone else's need, that when love finally did catch up with him, the only thing he was capable of loving was his own reflection, a devotion that could never, by its very nature, be answered by anything outside himself. Between the two of them, the whole shape of real love becomes visible precisely by its absence. For real love, the story quietly insists, without ever once saying so directly, requires two things that neither Echo nor Narcissus, in their different and opposite ways, was ever able to offer at the same time. A voice that can say something genuinely its own, and an ear turned outward enough to actually hear it. Rest now. Let the still water settle back into its perfect and unbroken calm, and the pale flower nod quietly at its own edge, and somewhere in the hills, if you listen closely enough in the last moment,
before sleep finally takes you,
let the old borrowed echo answer back, softly, one final time,